without the microphone I can speak, right? Can you hear me from the back side? Yes, sir. Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Department of English, NSTU, for organizing such a very wonderful program. It's not only wonderful, it is necessary. And I also thank the department chair, Afsana Mimi, Afsana Mosumi, so, and also all other senior faculty members of the department, and last but not least, the students who are more important for this program, I think, and my heartfelt thanks to all of you. And special thanks for inviting me with one of my teachers, Ghulam Hussain Habib, and I feel honored to be on the same program as the invited speakers with my teacher. Now, the topic that you have selected for this seminar is exciting, and in relation to Bangladesh, this is very important because the field is emerging in the country. I mean, the universities in the country have started understanding the value and necessity of translation studies only recently. But you know, the study of the discipline has started much earlier worldwide, though not as much old as other disciplines. This is going to be one of the most important disciplines or academic disciplines in the whole wide world, and the markers are visible. The topic that I have selected for my presentation today is translation studies as an independent discipline, theory and praxis. This is not going to be any rigorous paper that I usually present in other conferences. It's actually about, so far I have talked to your teachers, I have prepared it on the basis of my experience of teaching translation studies in the universities, as well as on the basis of my articles that I have written in different times on translation studies. Moreover, I am a practicing translator. I translate from Bengali into English. So on the basis of those three things, I have prepared my paper, and I'm going to present it in three ways. I will read out something from here that I have prepared. I'll also use the slides that you can already see, and I will also talk to you extempore. So bear with me if I make any kind of mix-up. So thank you so much. The title of my paper is Translation Studies as an Independent Discipline, Theory and Practice. Please, next slide. So this paper will cover these areas: Introduction to Translation and Translation Studies. First of all, I will briefly introduce, because the area is already known to you. Then a brief history of translation studies. This is overall worldwide study of the discipline, as well as emergence of the discipline in Bangladesh. Then literary translation and practices. I will focus on the practice in Bangladesh. Then I will give some overview about the whole thing that is going on worldwide about translation and translation studies. So next slide, please. So objectives of this paper. It focuses on translation in brief. It presents a brief history of translation studies, focuses on translation studies and an independent discipline. That is actually important, because earlier this translation studies was related to other disciplines, but now it is introduced in different universities and academia as an independent discipline. I mean, it's a kind of huge rise for the department, for the discipline. So then it explores literary translation scene and its practice in Bangladesh. And finally, it comments on the future of translation practice and translation studies in our country. So now I'm going to read out something from my paper. On the basis of this, you can see something here. I mean, I have accumulated some definitions, some ideas, some concepts developed by different translation studies scholars from both our country and abroad. So translation is now considered an emerging field, no doubt, because people worldwide, particularly the interested people, they have started growing attention to the area, and already various universities, even in South Asia, have started offering this, translation studies as a course, as a program, and that's why we can say that it's already accepted as a very important area of study. Different cultures and communities of the world have a scope of knowing one another and coming closer for their similarities or divergences. Translation, in this respect, certainly creates the opportunity. People from various communities, countries, nations, and languages like to experience diversities in literature and culture. Literatures of many cultures and languages are rich in tradition, content, style, technique, theme, and above all, in diversity. But they remain pigeonholed and reach only a certain number of readers. Translation of the literatures into the standard international language can change the whole scenario. People worldwide have an opportunity to be familiar with new literary voices and novel trends in literature. Readers experience something new about other peoples and their cultures. Translation, in this sense, is an important means for strengthening bonds, thereby between countries, continents, and cultures. It plays a great role in integrating nations and giving life to the literary works that exist only in a narrow space beyond the grasp of the world of readers. Translation now enjoys the wide attention of writers, critics, and readers around the world. Scholars have offered a wide range of definitions, features, elements, and processes of translation. Serious attention to translation was given long before, but major texts of the world literature had been translated a long time ago. Many renowned translators or translation studies scholars have explained the term in numerous ways, but over time, translators' approaches have changed to a great extent. We find differences among them even in the same decade. Approaches to translation differ from person to person, from practitioner to practitioner. Translators experiment on different approaches to translating literary texts into other languages. Interestingly, they also sometimes intervene. Now, if we look at this, just briefly, the very first one, it's universal. You can see here there are three terms. One is transfer, another is communication, and finally, interdiscipline. So, if we look at translation, then these words come into mind in the very preliminary stage. It's really a kind of transfer. Literally, it's transfer from one language into another. Then it is very important because when there was the cultural turn in translation studies, that was a huge development in the area, because earlier, usually it was the transfer of language. That's why it is interlingual transfer. But later on, when culture came into consideration, particularly some scholars, including Susan Basnet, who is called the living legend of translation studies. So she really focused on that. How translation is not about language only, it's also about culture. Then really, the discipline had received wide attention from different corners of the world. So that is why translation is also a kind of intercultural communication. And then finally, in form or appearance, and it to even transform. Whatever you find here, there are lots of things, but somehow you'll find a kind of progress towards understanding the area, because the three things I have mentioned in the very first number, then it's just a kind of progress of that particular thing, because cultural communication that is viewed from different perspectives. At the same time, interlingual transfer that's also viewed from different perspectives. So on the basis of that, you can also find that this is relevant to that earlier one. Later, even Fakularam himself said that translation is necessarily an act of interpretation. I mean, that's another new word, interpretation. So translation is not only transfer of culture or language, it's also a kind of interpretation. I mean, I will come to that area also later, because translation nowadays is also called or considered creative activity. Earlier it was considered a derivative area. I mean, it's dependent on others. I mean, translation was considered to be inferior, but now the area, the discipline has come to such a stage that people no more consider it to be inferior. So that's why the word interpretation is important here, because when someone translates a text, that particular person, that particular translator also interprets. So interpretation is a very new, not very new, but it's important in the area. And an intruding excursion into the territory of unending differences. It's very interesting. Particularly those who translate know well how different uh, attitudes or different approaches to translating the particular problematic area appear when one attempts to translate a particular piece. Sir also knows it very well that even the same text, if the translator translates right now, and if he does the same text, if he translates the same text after some months or some weeks, you will find that the same translator will come with different version. So that's why there are unending differences as far as translating and praxis is concerned. Then translation is not only a linguistic act, it's also an act of communication across cultures, very much close to the earlier one. Then this was recognized in the 60s by one of the grand figures of translation theory, Eugene Nida. Nida is a great scholar and is a practitioner of translation. And he has developed, I mean, through him, translation studies has progressed a little bit, particularly in the 60s. So Nida saw translation as one of the major means of constructing representations of other cultures. As I told you that intercultural communication is just the term, but different perspectives you view in different times. So here, look at this. It's a kind of representations of other cultures. So just he has shown it in a different way. So translation is a form of intercultural communication. So the same thing just is incorporated here. The next slide, please. Thank you. So I have just given some, I have tried to give some ideas about differences, how the scholars of translation studies have viewed the area. Here, according to Goethe, if you want to influence the masses, a simple translation is always best. I mean, it's about practice, right? Usually, we think that, and particularly from our South Asian perspectives, most of the people sometimes think that the more they make something complex, the better they are received. I mean, that kind of attitudes are there among some corners. But you know, this is something very interesting, because when you translate something and you want to reach the target audience, then it is better to convey or to translate it as simply as possible, so that because it reaches the people widely. And critical translations vying with the original really are of use only for conversations, the learned conduct among themselves, right? I mean, if you make it rigorous, say for example, some research work that only is seen or studied by only a handful of people. But if the same thing, I mean, if the practice itself, if the translation is made so complex deliberately, like T.S. Eliot, you know, T.S. Eliot himself declared that I make poetry difficult deliberately. I mean, it was deliberate enterprise. So That's why, I mean, Gator's observation is really very interesting, because you have to communicate through translation, and as much as it is simple, it is better for the wider audience. So when you offer a translation to a nation, says Victor Hugo, that nation will almost always look on the translation as an act of violence against itself. It's a bit, negative on the point, because the oft quoted line that if you translate something, at the moment you decide to translate something, translate the original. Remember, when you decide to translate something, it means you are going to do violence to the original. So if you have that kind of attitude, then I mean it's a negative attitude. It's the traditional approach to translation. But yes, there is no denying that you lose something. But later, Susan Butler, again I come to her, Susan Butler declared that oft-quoted line that what is lost in translation is poetry. I mean, she just gave the counter argument that it is not only about the loss, it is also about gain. I mean, through translation is you also gain something. I will come to that point later on as well. So then another important point that I want to make here, it is about Herod the Blancourt puts it in what is probably the first statement of the much vaunted principle of dynamic equivalence. I do not always stick to the author's words, nor even to his thoughts. I keep the effect he wanted to produce in mind, and then I arrange the material after the fashion of our time. Look at this. I mean, when he says that, I do not always stick to the author's words. I mean, he does not translate literally. At the same time, when he says that, not even to his thoughts. All right. I mean, there are two ways of approaching a text when you decide to translate. One is whether you will be very close to the original. I mean, you will be faithful to the original, or you will be a bit unfaithful. So when you are faithful to the very original, I mean, as much faithful as possible, then you are blind to that. I mean, that kind of blindness, that kind of faithfulness creates a distinctive kind of text. I mean, the product. But when you are concerned about the spirit of the original, I mean, the meaning that is conveyed, not exactly what he says, but what he really meant, I mean, the original. So if you are concerned about that, I mean, you are concerned about his thoughts. But something interesting here, he neither concentrates on the words nor the thoughts. Rather, he wants to keep the effect he wants to produce in mind. So that is a kind of huge jump over the translation. And then I arrange the material after the fashion of our time. Look at this, fashion of our time. So it's also a kind of approach. I mean, when you want to translate something, you think about some target audience. So who are the target audience? Nowadays, it is widely discussed. Say, for example, a book that you choose from Bengali literature, and then you have to do some research, and that research also includes the thoughts about the target audience. Are you going to translate it for South Asia? Are you going to translate it for the audience of the US or the UK? Then your translation approach would be different, right? So that's why he says that after the fashion of our time. So translation is also related to time. Translation is also related to setting. I mean, the place, the location, and the target audience. So that's why it is very interesting. So different times do not just require different words, but also different thoughts. And ambassadors usually dress in the fashion of the country they are sent to. Very, very nicely presented here. Say, for example, you send an ambassador from Bangladesh to the UK. Then if he just represents his own culture all the time, say for example the Bengali culture, I mean it will look a bit different, right? In an alienated, a kind of isolated figure he will look. But if he is there and if he wants to adjust with the environment, then he has to think about the English culture, English I mean environment. So the same thing is here. When you translate something, then you have to think about the adjustment of the things that you incorporate into the translation. I mean, the target language, target audience, the target culture, all these things must come into your mind. Okay, so for fear of appearing ridiculous in the eyes of the people, they try to please. Say, so recently I came to know that one of the young uh, boys from the country received an international award, and he went to the UK and he received the award from the Queen. And over there he wore lungi and gamsa, etc. But he represented the culture. Somehow it's a kind of love for the culture, all right, love for the country. But think about is the people over there. Yes, now the world has reached a certain stage where people are more liberal and they have honor for different cultures. But if you think about this particular statement, then yes, he will look alien, he will look ridiculous. That's true. So only to evade that, you have to think about making the translation readable and accessible to the target audience and to the target culture. That is one of the points that you can remember when you think about translating. Then another one, no matter what else the translator does, he or she has to be true to the reader of the translation. This is another very nice point. Then true to the reader of the translation. Though it is related to the earlier version, then you have to think about the target audience. Exactly, you have to think about the reader. I mean, what the readers demand. Say, if you translate a Bengali book from Bangladesh, and if your target audience is Bangladeshi people, then yes, you can have a different approach. But when your target audience should be the English people, the American people, then you have to think about the readers. I mean, readers must always come into your mind. It is about the very recent trend of translation. Next, yeah. So this is the final one about translation that I will talk about, and this is something very significant. Even I was talking about it with Hamid sir. So there is the ever-present gulf between theory and practice, between what translators profess to be doing and what they actually do. All right. I mean, it is a very complex area. I mean, if you are a translator, and at the same time, if you are a translation studies scholar, then a kind of gulf is created between in you or within you. And what is that? You know the theory, and when you practice, ultimately sometimes the theories intervene. And if the theories always intervene, then your creativity, I mean your spontaneity will be hampered. At the same time, if you are not concerned about theories at all, then you will feel guilty. Oh, I have learned theories, but I'm not following this. I mean that kind of, tension, that kind of kind of crisis is created within you. But yes, this is true that as a translator, if you know the theories, it is a huge benefit for you. But remember, when you translate, you have to forget the theories. All right, you have to be creative over there. As a translator, if you want to be a translator, you have to be a creative person because theories don't work. There are great translators in the world who have studied theories, but they have just violated. I mean, violation is also a kind of pride and a proud approach to the translation exercise. I mean, you have to violate the rules. It is also true about poetry writing. If you are a poet, you should know the rules. But when you write poetry, you have to break all the rules. All right, so something like this. So it's also true about translation. So translators are responsible for the integrity of both the cultures to which they belong and the texts they translate. I like this statement because it's really something that we all should follow, because when you translate something you have to think about the original culture, original language. At the same time, you have also to think about the target language and target culture and target audience. So I mean, if you can make a mix of this in your translation, I mean, it will be a very wonderful thing. I mean, the final product will be praiseworthy. Then, yes, translation then is not just a process that happens in the translator's head. Readers decide to accept or readers reject translations. You have to keep it in mind that when you translate something, It depends on the readers how they just receive it, how they are going to whether they are going to reject it or accept it, something like this. So, okay, now I'm going to read something from here. So translation now enjoys the wide attention of writers, critics, and readers around the world. Scholars have offered a wide range of views, as I already mentioned it. Then, then now I'm coming up to the area of translation studies. I mean, so far I have given some slides on translation itself and translation and views about the scholars, views about the translations of the scholars. And now I am going over to the translation studies, because you know translation practice and translation studies as a discipline, we have to understand things that are untranslatable. Say, for example, the untranslatability of a text. Then how will you overcome that? Translation studies will help you overcome all these problems and challenges, and it helps develop analytical, practical, and evaluative skills. And it also helps develop aesthetic skills as well as skills for explaining a text. And it identifies the areas of complexities in translating, then develops research skills, practical translation skills, and strategies for managing complex linguistic and cultural conventions. So these are the things that translation studies does. Next slide, please. Okay, now it is one of the focal points that I want to discuss in my presentation, that is translation studies as an interdiscipline. At the same time, it is an independent discipline. I'm sure all of you have the idea about interdisciplinary study, right? So when I call translation studies an interdiscipline, it means it is independent in one hand and it is related to other disciplines on the other, right? Now, translation studies is interdisciplinary because it is at present related to fields such as comparative literature. And comparative literature is a very exciting area now. And without translation studies, comparative literature, the study of comparative literature is limited. Then cultural studies, then gender studies, linguistics, and many more. So it is also related to the area of interpreting. So when I am calling it interdisciplinary, then I am relating it to the study of all these areas. I mean the important areas. So cultural studies and comparative literature, these are you know, not possible without approaching the translation studies. So next slide, please. Okay, now I'm coming to the area. I mean, how translation studies emerged in the world. Then I will come to its emergence in Bangladesh. So, landmark declaration. I'm sure all of you know that because you are studying translation studies. So, the man James Holmes, right? His seminal paper that he presented in 1972, and it was titled "The Name and Nature of Translation Studies." So for the first time, he has used this term, translation studies. So automatically, the world of scholarly activities in relation to translation became alert, and they just grabbed it instantly, because translation itself is very old. People have been translating for a long time, even before the zero era. Okay, people started translating, but disciplinary approach, scholarly approach to the area, it was not in the minds of the people. Even the translators themselves wrote some essays uh, focusing on their own views and commenting on their own activities. No one approached it systematically before the declaration. I mean, the name and nature of translation studies. So that's why James Holmes is considered to be a pioneering figure for the emergence and for the development of the discipline translation studies. So uh, it has progressed faster since 1972. Then translation is studied now in different universities, and particularly in 1972 it was declared in a conference, but academically it was discussed and explored widely in 1980s. Maybe in 1983, scholars started writing about these and giving serious attention to this. And later on, different universities started offering some courses, particularly in the UK. And even journals were published. Different institutes and universities started publishing journals, and even many universities uh, organized conferences on translation studies. If you think about Bangladesh, do you know uh, about the conference absolutely devoted to translation studies that happened in Bangladesh? Do you know any example?
Khulna University.
Khulna University. And
Shafiqul.
Rashid. I don't know about Russia, but East West University, they organized a conference in 2016. It was absolutely about translation studies. I mean, you can understand that people have started, I mean, people of Bangladesh have started focusing on translation studies seriously. And but interesting and fascination about studying translation academically, it began in 1950s. As I told you that individually, the practitioners and also some scholars wrote about translation, but that was not systematic, that was not academically prone. So after 1972, it really progressed. So then communication in multilingual and multicultural societies influenced the necessity of translation and systematic study of translation. So after that, all these things happened after 1980s through this seminal and landmark declaration by James Holmes. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then background. As I told you, that translation is someone said translation is old. I mean, the practice is old. It's said that the first significant translation in the Western world was of the Hebrew Bible. I'm sure all of you know that. It is called Septuagint. All right. 70 translators were given the task of translating. All of them did it differently, not differently, sorry. They did it exclusively, separately, on their own. But interestingly, the Bible translation became similar. I mean, there are not unending differences. There are not differences at all. So that's why it is a landmark. I mean, translation of religious scriptures, translation of non-fiction, translation of uh, uh, disciplines like law and other things. I mean, all these translations occur in a certain way. But when you think about literary translation, then you are not following the Septuagint, because they had translated something very holy, something very uh, uh, religious, all right? I mean, you have to, because if you translate a religious text and if you violate, if the meaning is, I mean, if you become creative, then you are at the risk of losing your life. It happened when church was very powerful. Once, maybe Dole, I can't remember the name, he was burned to death because he just changed something from the original. He did not violate it completely, but he changed something, and he wanted to be creative and he wanted to make it more readable. So that's why he was burned to death. So you have to be careful when you translate something holy, something religious, or something law related. All right, then you have to be very careful. But in literary translation, you have unending freedom, but not the liberty to license, right? So you have to think about this. Then creative approach to translation had started much earlier, but John Dryden, I'm sure all of you know, John Dryden made it more visible by translating Virgil's verses. I mean, just the two opposite picture of translation. One is Bible translation, another is translation of a literary text. think about John Dryden. He translated some verses of Virgil, and what did he do? Look at this. Dryden had Virgil use words such as he would probably have written if he were living as an Englishman. This is a very important thing about understanding creative translation. Look, Dryden translated Virgil's poetry, but he translated in such a way that Virgil himself was an Englishman. I mean, if he were alive, he would translate, I mean, he would write the verse just like that. Where is Virgil and where is Dryden? I mean, a lot of time, a lot of years are there between the two figures. But that is actually a kind of creative approach to translation. And it is very much relevant about literary translation. When you translate literature, you have to be creative so that it becomes readable, so that spontaneity is visible, so that the translation is free, so that it is literary. Because literariness, maintaining literariness, is more important in translating literary pieces rather than giving attention to the original. Even there are debates and arguments about this. That's why translation studies is there. Please, next slide. Translation studies in theory. I'm not going to read, what is the time now? And
It says 11:56.
56. Then how much time shall I get more?
You can take whatever you like.
45 more.
You can take whatever you like.
Oh my goodness. Then it will be a boring session. Okay, if you feel bored, then I will stop here. Okay, that slides are there. All right. So thank you. Gensler, I'm very fortunate that he's a professor of Massachusetts University Amherst. In 2015, I went to Italy to attend a conference on translation studies. He was one of the resource speakers over there, and I met him. And if you have read different books on translation studies, Edwin Gensler must come into your mind because he has written lots of books, even some of them in collaboration with Susan Bastet. So I was fortunate to meet him and also meet Susan Bastet in Italy, and because Susan Bastet was also a keynote speaker over there. So and I talked to them about translation in Bangladesh, and they were so excited about knowing that Bangladesh has also started offering translation studies courses in the universities. So I closely discussed these things, I mean, translation related things with them. So this Gensler, the person, the scholar has said that translation serves as a metaphor for writing that frees, transforms, and multiplies rather than possesses, controls, and defines. I mean, he's a very prolific translator as well. And he theorized translation in a very in multifarious ways. So he says that it's a metaphor actually. Translation itself is a metaphor, and it frees, and it transforms, and it multiplies. It means translation has a wide scopes, and it continues to make you free, make your cultural aspects available to the readers and audience of other cultures, rather than it controls. Translation cannot be done in a very compartmentalized manner. I mean, you are not feeling squeezed when you translate. You become free and you make the text free and available to the target audience. Then John Kester says that translation, like politics, I like it very much. Because if you want to be a translator, you can follow this. Translation, like politics, is an art of the possible. I mean, nothing is impossible. Another version of this. Translation, like politics. That is a wonderful metaphor. Why is it like politics? What happens in politics? Because in politics, compromise is always inevitable, and compromise is also universal in politics. The same thing happens in translation. I mean, it is a kind of metaphor that is unusual, but it is true. That politics and translation, how can it be compared? Yes, compromise. Sometimes you have to compromise the meaning. Sometimes you have to compromise the original. Sometimes you have to create something new. Sometimes you have to, you know, shun something that is in the original. I mean, have to be creative, completely creative when you translate. So that is actually the compromise. It's very important. And translation problems are not math problems. It's also interesting. Translation problems are not math problems that have only one or at most a strictly limited number of right answers. I mean, you cannot say that this is right or that is wrong, because when you translate, you just create a version, and when another one translates it, he creates another version. I mean, lots of versions. Even if you give a short story to 100 people, 100 translators, I'm sure 100 versions will be there. So you cannot say one is right, another is wrong. But yes, as a translation studies scholar, you can say that this is good or that is bad, or this is according to that. I mean, he has followed this approach or he has followed that approach. I mean, that kind of debates and arguments and exploration may go on. But you cannot say that this is exactly correct or that is wrong. So that's why it is not like math actually. So as a subfield of literature, and literature is indisputably an art rather than a science. So art is freedom, remember. And when you are a translator, you have also freedom. So it's not science. But yes, scientific ways are there that you can follow, but it is not pure science. And then translation is subjective in essence. Yes. If a translator from a certain cultural background translates a text, he will have some intervention from his own culture. Say, for example, a Bangladeshi who has been living in the UK for quite a long time, if he translates a Bangladeshi text, he will have some intervention from the UK culture. The same thing will be different from the Bangladeshi who has been living in the country and is translating the same text. So that kind of intervention happens. That's why it is called translation is subjective in essence. Please, next. Okay, this is Susan Basnet, about whom I have been talking about. This is something that happened. I mean, think about equivalence. This is such a term that has been in discussion for a long time. I mean, translation means equivalence, putting equivalence. That is an old approach. That's an old outmoded approach to translation. This vexatious term occupied much of the time of translation scholars. But yes, modern translation, I mean, translation that has been happening nowadays, it no more supports or endorses the equivalence. I mean, a long way has been there in the development of translation. Again, Gensler, I'm not reading all of them. Okay, okay, this one, Basnet, she says that poetry is not what is lost in translation, it is rather what we gain through translation and translators. All right, I mean, oft-quoted line has been just rejected, and she wonderfully says that it is also about gain. I mean, a positive attitude to translation. Okay, then next slide, please. I'm skipping some of them. Okay, this is something that is why translation should be taken positively. Why? One reason, at least, if someone is absolutely negative about translation, for one thing at least, he or she should consider it valuable. Why? Because one reason translation is superior to the original is the access it grants. Think about 100 years of solitude. Think about Iliad. Think about Oedipus Rex. All right. Are you reading them in original? No. All of us are reading them in translation. And if they had not been translated, then we could never have had access to them, right? So that's why, that is only one reason that translation is superior to the original, because we don't know Spanish, we don't know Portuguese, we don't know other European languages, but we know English is an international language. That's what we can have access to them. And that's why you can say that translation is superior in that sense, at least in that sense. So without translation, there's an example of a book here. I mean, we could never have access of this book if it were not translated. So this is, for the rest of us, it could only be a doorstop. I mean, this is Benjamin Palop's observation about translation, positive attitude to translation. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. In Bangladesh, so I'm just coming to our own practice and study of the area. Translation before the independence of Bangladesh. When we use the word Bangladesh, then ultimately 1971 comes into our mind. All right. With Bengali literature, it is a bit wide, right? Because the Kolkata writers, they write in Bengali. Even some people in Silchar and Tripura, they also write in Bengali. But when we term it Bangladesh, Bangladeshi writer, we must set a particular time, right? Because Bengali literature written by Bangladeshi writers, Bengali literature written by West Bengal writers. I mean, that should be approached differently. So it is, I mean, when you do research about Bangla literature, try to make it clear at least that you are handling the writers of Bangladesh. I mean, who are writing in Bengali. So translation before the independence of Bangladesh. What kind of translation took place? Then translation after 1971. Then contemporary translation literature seen in Bangladesh. I will focus on this. I mean, in brief, because there is not enough time, maybe. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So translation studies as an academic discipline in Bangladesh. Then prospects and future of translation studies in the country. Next, please. Then Bengali literature in translation. There are some specimens here I have just used. I will talk about because uh, I told you that before 1971 there are not so many translations that happened in the country. Only and another point that I want to make it clear for you that I have been focusing on translation from Bengali into English. Uh, there is a rich history and tradition of translation from English and other languages into Bangla. So my paper actually focuses on translation of Bengali literature into English. So that's why, sir, please don't mind because I am not using translation.
I don't have any mind.
So from because sir is, if I just rank, sir is number one when it comes into translating. No, not that you are before me, because from English to Bengali, it tops the list. All right, but somehow anyway, I'm not going to that. So look at this. I'm sure you have heard of Dawood Haider's. Most of the translations that have happened earlier were done by the Western or European translators. Look at this, Dawood Haider's, and even some of them were from India. Lillary, Alone in Darkness, and Other Poems. It was published in 1978, and it was published by United Writers, Kolkata. Then Obsidian, it was translated by Shoti, or I'm not Shati or Shoti, was published by Rupa and Company. Taslima Nasrin's Light Up at Midnight, Selected Poems, it was translated in 1992 by Caroline Wright. That time, particularly in the 90s, in the 80s, Taslima Nasrin was in discussion. So that's why Western translators, Western people had given attention to Taslima Nasrin. So these are valuable translations actually, but unfortunately we don't have access to them because there is a marketing policy in our country is so weak that we just publish and we keep it, all right, and we do not promote the translation. That is one of the huge lackings uh, that are available in our country, particularly the publishers do not pay attention to that. Then The Game in Reverse, it is also translated by Caroline Wright and published from New York. Look at this. I mean, in that time, but those books are not available here. Even we do not know about them. And The Field of the Embroidered Quilt. I'm sure you have heard of Nokshikatha March. All right. So it was translated by E.M. Milford. Interestingly, this was translated much earlier in 1939. You can imagine. I mean, before 1971. I mean, even before 1952. But I had been looking for it for a long time. So how can I read that? But recently, one of the publishers, not publishers actually, they help translating and editing books, Modhupu, it will emerge very soon. They have published a new version of the book you can buy. It's available in the market now. And it is such a very interesting read. I have finished reading it recently. Though I mean, the translator has maintained rhyme, and in doing that, something is lost from there. But yes, it is interesting to read Lokshikata Martin English translation. So you can collect the book, and it's a rich read if you have it in your collection. Then Gypsy Work, translated by Barbara Painter and Ian Laplaw, published from London. So you can see these are the major translations you can see that happened even before 1971 and in and around 1971. So, but yeah, as I mentioned, that marketing policy really made them unavailable because of the lack of attention to them. We could not make it. Please, next slide. Then major publications in translation. Uh, can you see? All right. I mean, there are lots, so that's why I have just incorporated here. Hasan Azizul Haq, 12 stories, translated by Bhaskar Chattopadhyay. It is published by BLB, Bangaldesh Books. Recently, Dhaka Translation Center, one of the centers that is the concern of ULAB. ULAB is doing something good about translation. So Dhaka Translation Center has been giving emphasis on showcasing Bangladeshi literature in English translation. They have already published some wonderful books, and they have organized some workshops with international translators. And even I'm happy that I've been part of 3 workshops. And over there, Orunava Sinha was the translation leader. Orunava Sinha, you know, is just more than machine translator. All right, he translates with 2 hands. He has already translated more than 60 books. And I can give a piece of information that recently, one of the novelists from our country offered 20 lakh taka for translating 1 book. All right. I mean, you can feel inspired to be a translator, because nowadays translation is not about only an act without money. It is now considered to be an act for earning money as well. So that's why you can feel inspired. Anyway, so Dhaka Translation Center has been doing an amazing job. They have already published some wonderful books, and including this one, Hasan Azizul Haq, 12 stories. And if you think about the quality translation, standard translation, reliable translation, yes, I personally can say that this is something that you can explore. And on the side of the enemy, short stories in translation, and on my birthday and other poems in translation, that is translated by Khadimul Islam. Yes, he translates well. Then Syed Shamsul Haq, 2 novellas, and Imdadul Haq Milan, 2 novellas. They have been published in 2017, and these 2 are translated by Shaugat Ghosh. And I have worked on Imdadul Haq Milan's 2 novellas. I've already written an article on that, and it's going to be published soon. And Rizia Rahman, Letters of Blood, and it is translated by Orunava Sinha. Then Moinul Hassan Sabir, The Mercenary, translated by Shobnam Nadia. Shobnam Nadia is another wonderful translator from Bangladesh. She lives in the US, but actually she has translated some seminal books, including the one by Shahin Akhtar, that is called Bilavid Rangomala. It has been published recently. So yeah, quality translations are coming up. Then yes, there are some other books here. I'm not reading all of them, and most of them are good translations. Even Nia Zaman, Professor Nia Zaman, she has also translated some books. Then Kobir Chowdhury's translation. There are even some translations from other parts, like Jackie Kobe. She has translated 2 books by Selina Hossain, River of My Blood, and another one. I mean, yes, translations are coming up from Bangladesh. If you think about the literary scene, translation scene in Bangladesh, the scenario is positive and the future is bright about translation in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. Okay. Then some other publications, particularly I will focus on some names here. One of them is The Wonders of Vilayat. Have you heard of this earlier? The Wonders of Vilayat. Yeah, this is done by Kaiser Haq, and this book has been one of the prestigious books and it has been featured in one of the UK leading publications, and the Wonders of Vilayat, and that is a very valuable book that is translated. Then Quartet, this is also done by Kaiser Hawk. Kaiser Hawk is the leading translator of the country. If you if you name a few, it will be one, and then for Bularam I have already mentioned. Then Niyaz Zaman and Shabnam Nadia, they are coming up. And Qazi Mustain Billah sir has also done one, that is Sons of the Sea. Then I have some translations, but I'm not sure how they are. A few other books like A River Called Titash. This is one of the seminal translations. A River Called Titash. Okay, Adito Mallavarmas, and it is published by University of California Press. When for the first time I came to know that it is available in English translation, I brought the book from the US and I have read it. It is a mesmerizing one, though it's a creative translation, but yeah, wonderfully done. And it is translated by Kalpana Bardhan. She is a university professor. Then you must have heard of Michael Madhusudhan Dutt's epic in translation, that is the Slaying of Meghnad, Ramayana from colonial Bengal. This is the title of the translation, and it is translated by Clinton B. Seeley. Then even another book by Michael Madhusudhan Dutt has been translated, and these are the major translations you can just think about. Next one, the recent major ones, The Triumph of the Snake Goddess. Have you heard of? Yes, and it is called the Epic of Bengal. Epic, I mean Manasha Mongol Kabbya, that has been translated by Kaiser Hawk. It is published by Harvard University Press, and it is a different kind of translation. I'm happy that I have written an article on this and I have presented in an international conference, and I'm working on the paper to turn it into an article. And this is called the composite creative translation. I mean the seminal example of a composite creative translation. I mean it is not translation from one version only. Manasha Mongol Kabbya is I mean, it is existing in 5 versions. He has collected all the 5 versions and he has read all of them, and he has taken the story and he has translated freely. I mean, he has written actually. He retold the story. Not exactly he has translated. He retold the story, but I have read it. It is an enthralling read. You should collect the book and you should read it. I would say, The Triumph of the Snake Goddess. Such a pleasure reading such translation. And then The Essential Jagur, another great book. It is translated. It is actually the edited book, translated by different translators from both Bangladesh and India, edited by Fakul Alam and Radha Chakraborty. And this is also published by Harvard University Press and Vishwa Bharati. 2 versions are there. You can read it. Modern verse, songs, verse, songs, and story. I mean, all the genres that Rabindranath Tagore has produced takes place in this. In this edited book. Amartya Sen has said that this is the most important book about Rabindranath Tagore. So you should also think about this when you think about translation literature in Bangladesh. Recently translated Ocean of Sorrow, and before that The Unfinished Memoirs. You have heard of Ocean of Sorrow. It is the translation of Bishad Sindhu. It is translated by Fakul Alam. Then I talked about it, Beloved Rangomala, very wonderful novel by okay, what's her name? Beloved Rangomala. Okay. Then Love and Death in Krishnanagar. This is another very interesting book. Mrityu Khuda by Kazi Nazrul Islam. It is translated by Niyaz Zaman. Love and Death in Krishnanagar. Very beautiful title. I mean, Mrityu Khuda and Love and Death in Krishnanagar, there is no similarity. So that's why you can understand that when you translate, you should not translate to the word. Oh, Shiner, exactly. Shiner. Thank you, sir. Next slide, please. Then reliable books on translation studies in Bangladesh. I mean, there are not so much. This is so unfortunate. There are some scholars in Bangladesh There are some practitioners in Bangladesh, but they could not write some books on translation studies. But at least you can think about these two. One is translation theory and practice. It is edited by Niyaz Zaman. And another one is translation studies, exploring identities. Yusuf Pune University organized this conference on that, and they just published a book. This is reliable and edited by Fukula and Ahmed and so on. Next slide, please. This is just a kind of self. I mean, I have written 5 articles on translation literature in Bangladesh. This one is literary translation trend and practice in Bangladesh. It is published in a Routledge journal, and I think if you read the article, you will find an overview of the translation scene in Bangladesh. I have tried to write there. Then multiple approaches to translating the poems and songs in the essential Tagore. I have presented it in one of the conferences. Another one, women writers of Bengali literature, transcending borders through translation. I have presented it at the University of London. It is just in April 2020. So it was a rich experience for me to translate, to present a paper on Bangladeshi women writers in translation. So I will work on that for further. Then another one is trajectories from global south to our literature, canonizing the triumph of the snake goddess and ocean of sorrow. I have recently presented it in one of the conferences. Then finally, the triumph of the snake goddess, a composite creative translation of verse into prose. So it is also, I mean, these 5 articles on translation I myself have worked on, and I look forward to publishing them in different formats. So please, next one. Then major publishing houses that publish translation. Bangla Academy. So there is negative approach to Bangla Academy, because Bangla Academy published some books which are not quality in translation, and it does not show quality in translation. So that's why lots of people have negative attitudes to Bangla Academy. But recently, as the government has emphasized on translation, Bangla Academy has focused on publishing some good books on translation. The University Press Limited has been doing a great job. They have already published some wonderful books. And Bengal Lights books, I have already mentioned it. Then Bengal Publications, Agami Prakashin, Anna Prakash, Adon Public, they are actually Bengali oriented, but they are also publishing some translations and some books in English. Then leading international journals on translation and translation studies. These are the great journals. As I told you that how translation studies is progressing rapidly. The proof is this, because these are the journals which are Routledge journals, Project News journals, Brill journals, and all of them are publishing wonderful works on translation and translation studies. And if you can say, I'm not reading the names, even there are some more. Next, all of them are great journals. I mean, you can think about sending your work after writing some articles. And next one, please. Okay. All right. These are, I mean, as you are students of translation studies, you know, these are the important essays you should always look forward to. The translation turning cultural studies, then the task of the translator, the name and nature of translation studies, on linguistic aspects of translation, the politics of translation, then translation community utopia. These are the great works on translation studies. Next. Then contemporary research on translation. I have just collected some titles that have recently been published in those kinds of journals that I have just mentioned. Look at this, how the translation studies incorporating the research, and this is the proof. Look at this. Can Google Translate be taught to translate literature? A case for humanists to collaborate in the future of machine translation. It is published only recently. I mean, that kind of recent work is going on in translation studies. I mean, the focus is so diverse, so varied. And next one is on the untranslatability of literary form, framing contemporary translation on literature. It is published in Translation Review. Another one, visible interventions, the mediating presence of the literary translator in theory and practice. than the inhumanity or humanity of translation. Autobiographical self-translation, translator as the author, narrator, and protagonist. I mean, interesting titles. When you want to do research on translation studies, you have also to have in your thought and mind what kind of work is going on worldwide on this area. But in our country, people are yet to think about those things because a lot of progress has taken place in the area of translation studies. But Bangladesh has left behind. Still, we are hopeful, we are optimistic that people are coming up. Next. Even these are also the titles. I'm going to read them. One is very important here: gender politics in translation. The case of Ekrito Femina. This is very interesting. Gender politics, geopolitics. These are also studied in relation to translation and translation studies. And yeah, next one, please. How a standard article on translation studies begins. Just a sample for I have brought it. So this is the title. Look at this. If you just take it as a model, you will feel a kind of inspired. I will read the abstract on that. Translation as a means of internationalization, the case for world literacy. It is one of the titles published in a Routledge journal. I will just read the next one. Read the abstract. Look at this. If you want to do research, then you can start just like this. An abstract being written just like that. I mean, it's the standard, reliable beginning of a standard publication in translation studies. You have seen that right title. Translation and Intercultural Studies, with its interdisciplinary, cross-linguistic, and intercultural nature, shares common grounds with world literature, which thrives on comparative studies and the internationalization of literary themes and genres. The present study explores, look at the language. The present study explores the role of translation in building bridges of knowledge, literary appreciation, and recognition between Arabic literature and culture and other world literatures. It examines the effect of translation on the works of two Arab writers, namely Naguib Mahfouz, an Egyptian writer who won 1988 Nobel Prize for Literature, and Mahmoud Darwish, a Palestinian poet whose 35 poetry and prose collections have been translated into 35 languages. The translation of their works by word expert translators has been functional enough to embody the novel human values shared by international audience. The findings support the thesis, look at this, the language. The findings support the thesis that although the translation of literature may not fully convey and transform the authentic and genuine essence of and images of the original, this does not render the translation of literature as a threat to the integrity of the original text. This interactive relationship between translation and world literature has proven its zest and vigor to inspire further interdisciplinary research. So this is the proposal of doing research on a certain topic. So look at the language, look at the way how he proposes, how he builds the argument, what is the central argument. Then he will just continue, elaborating or deliberating on the proposal. So this is the ideal example of a research proposal that is constituted in the abstract. So if you feel inspired to write research articles on translation studies, you have to explore some wonderful articles on those journals that I have shown. And I would like to request you to go through that because you are the translation studies students, or you will be future or emerging scholars very soon. So next slide, please. So that's why the emerging translators should think about all these things. Just in brief, if you want to be a translator, these are the steps that you have to follow. It is offered by Clifford E. Landers. He himself is a translator and scholar of translation studies. Read the entire text at least once. Do any necessary research first. Deal with possible roadblocks at an early stage. Roadblocks means as you have decided to translate a text, you read it first, try to locate the complex areas, then research on that, find the solutions. Then negotiate a reasonable deadline. Say, for example, you have selected a text to translate, you will just think about it completing within 1 year or something like that. I mean, make a deadline. Somehow, in brief, these are the steps that a translator can follow. Next one, and this is the elaborate one, and I like it so much. And this is very reliable. Robert Bly's famous 8 stages of translation. Read the entire work at least twice. Determine the authorial voice. I mean, the original author's voice should be understood. Next, do the first draft. Next, consult with an educated native speaker. It is not always possible, but it is important. I mean, you translate it, do the first draft, then consult a native speaker. I mean, how does it read? Say, for example, a Bangladeshi translator has translated text into English, but if or until a native speaker reads it, then readability cannot be justified. All right, so that's why for better outcome, choose a native speaker so that it reads well or smooth. And then revise the manuscript. Then have a highly literate native speaker. Then another speaker should be there. I mean, literate in the sense the speaker must have literary sense. To become a literary translator, one must have the taste of literature. I mean, one must have the knowledge of nuances, of literariness. And that's why it is said here, have a highly literate native speaker. Go over the manuscript line by line with a native speaker of the source language. Now, source language speaker should be there, and you have to work closely with him. Make the final changes, run it through a spell check, and let it rest for a few days. This is magical. You finish a text and keep it aside for 1 month or 2 months or even for 6 months. Then come back to it and read it again without considering the original. Then you will find a lot of changes again. And then give it one last reading and send it off. Final. That is the final product of a translation. I mean, if you follow this, you can be a good translator. Your final product will be reliable and good, I think. I don't know, sir will agree or not. Yes, theory should be there. You have to follow it, but again, you have to violate it, okay? The magic that a translator creates, this is philosophical, and this is impossible to glean out how and when and under what circumstances a translator overcomes the challenges. Despite centuries of debate about translation, however, we lack an adequate vocabulary for the descriptions of what we do when we translate. I mean, debates have been going on for a long time, even for centuries. But still, we do not know how the translator overcomes the challenges. It is absolutely subjective. And it is time specific, it is mood specific, it is dependent on the situation, context, etc. So actually what happens in the minds of a translator when he does the work, it cannot be read out, it cannot be gleaned out at all. So this is the magic of the work of translation. So next, please. This is concluding remarks, and I want to read it here again because yeah, I have forgotten the script. All right. This paper intends to draw to a close with Busnett's arguments about the scope and prospect of literary translation and translation studies in the contemporary world, which is also relevant about the literary translation of literacy translation of Bangladesh. She quotes in her observations the quotation. This is the quotation. I feel very hopeful about translation studies at the end of the 20th century. We have come a long way, and the dismal days of the translator as second-rate, second-class writer are behind us. Translation is of vital importance today because, as Haas suggests, translation both overcomes differences between cultures while revealing them more fully, and we need to be aware of those differences in order to deal with them. And Haas goes on, Even further, he portrays the world as a growing heap of texts, translations of translations of translations. None of them unique because they are all in some way translation of something else. It is a sustaining thought. Translation is inevitable. All translations are originals and all originals are translations. The old hierarchies are dismissed, and the translation, as Walter Benjamin so beautifully tells us, gives life to texts that otherwise would have rotted away into oblivion. Quote ends. People from different countries and cultures often come together in different forums in order to share literature and culture of their own with one another. To make this happen successfully, one needs to comprehend each other, or else bridging the cultural as well as literary gaps will not be possible. In this respect, as language is a strong barrier, translation of literary texts from one language to another is inevitable. Basnet is very optimistic about literary translation and translation studies as a discipline, which are playing an important part to make connections between cultures and nations around the world. Translation is no more considered a second-rate work, and the translators are now acknowledged as having the status of creative writers. Literary translation indeed opens up opportunities for various cultures to be connected and enriched, sometimes contributing something valuable to each other. No one can deny the significance and necessity of translation now, because the current world progresses with the recurrence of various cultures, with the resources of various cultures that are made available through translation. Moreover, it is undeniable that, I quote, the world is a growing heap of texts, translations of translations of translations. On that note, it is justified to comment that the future of literary translation in Bangladesh is also bright and promising, as people from various backgrounds are becoming enthusiastic about translation literature. As far as the global reality is concerned, more translations of Bangladeshi literature into English are necessary. Many people take part in workshops on literary translations organized by potential institutes like Dhaka Translation Center and Bangla Academy, and participate in conferences on translation studies held at universities in the country. They are also taking up inspired emerging translators to carry across great books of Bengali literature into English, so that international readers get hold of them. Nowadays, translation studies is offered as a course in various universities and institutes around the country. Promising translators have already begun to emerge with at least one or two books to their credit. Moreover, scholars and academics in both public and private universities, as well as other institutions in Bangladesh, cast a huge emphasis on research and practice in translation. The picture of literary translation in Bangladesh was a bit dismal in the past, but the trend has changed now, and the scope is escalating day by day, forming a strong foundation with individual faiths. Now the picture of practice is also brighter than before, with numerous translated texts already published and spread around the world, along with many more forthcoming and several magnificent projects taken up by both emerging